My name is Dandelion. I go by Decentralion on Twitter, and I'm here to talk to you about SourceCred. But first, let's talk a little bit about open source. So I'm going to say something I think will be pretty uncontroversial, which is that open source software is awesome. Here are just a couple of the projects that I use all the time, and I bet a lot of people in this room could fill a couple more slides worth. Open source software is also really essential. So much of the internet today runs in one form or another on open software, which makes it surprising that we don't do much to reward open source developers. So here are two examples. One is that NumPy, which is ubiquitous in the data science world, got no funding at all for the first 10 years of its existence. And OpenSSL, which pretty much all internet commerce depends on, wasn't funded until Heartbleed nearly took down the internet. And in some sense, these are the success cases. Most open source projects never get any funding whatsoever. What open source maintainers get, instead of funding, is notifications. Lots and lots of thankless notifications. So many so that this is actually the top image in Google image search for the words open source maintainer. So when Google image search is throwing shade at you, you really know you have a problem. So SourceCred is our attempt to help. Some of the goals that we have is we want to help get more people involved in open source project maintenance and not just in like filing bugs. We want maintainers to feel seen and appreciated for the hard work that they're doing, and maybe eventually, hopefully, they get paid. And we want to build infrastructure that makes it easier to fund open source. And that's both technical infrastructure in the sense of like payments, but also social infrastructure in the sense of figuring out who deserves those payments. So that's where SourceCred comes in. Our mission is to empower open source projects by creating cred. Now, cred is a legible reputation metric for individual projects. The idea is that you can earn it through doing a number of useful things, like maybe triaging issues, fixing bugs, writing documentation. And crucially, cred is really controlled and influenced by the project's maintainers. So if you have a project that is really suffering because it's buried under a mountain of issues, the maintainers could go and say, okay, triaging issues is really what we need. So we're going to multiply the cred there. And maybe like, thanks for the features, but we already have enough. So we're not going to give that much cred for writing new features. So at its heart, this means we need to solve the credit attribution problem, which means we need to figure out who are the people that are actually adding a lot of value as compared to just people who look the part or are best at playing the game. And I think a great example here is that in the discovery of DNA, Rosalind Franklin really deserved a lot of the credit for doing this work, but she wasn't recognized because the systems at the time kind of ignored her in favor of Watson and Crick. So today in the world of open source reputation, we have a couple legible metrics. I would make them into two categories. One is those which are easy to gain. For example, your number of contributions or the number of lines of code that you've changed. And the other is stuff that's basically popularity contests, like the number of followers that you have on GitHub or the number of stars that your project has. So we need a fundamentally much stronger approach, and we think we can do that by starting with a better algorithm, specifically PageRank. So PageRank is kind of the core idea behind Google search. Back when Larry Page and Sergey Brin were just getting started, what they did was they published the paper on PageRank. The basic idea is that a website is important if other important websites link to it. And it's crucially not a popularity contest. So in this example, we have a couple blobs that are representing nodes in the PageRank graph. If this were just a popularity contest, then the yellow circle labeled E would have the most weight because it's got a lot of little nodes pointing to it. But in reality, PageRank finds that the orange node C, although it doesn't have many nodes pointing to it, it has very important nodes pointing to it. So it's actually more important. So the question is, what if we took the same idea, but now did PageRank on function call graphs, where our function is important if other important functions depend on it? Or we could do PageRank on GitHub interactions, where issues and polls are important based on the identities of people who have interacted with them and the other issues or polls that reference them. Or we could do PageRank on the project dependency structure itself, finding that dependencies that lots of other projects depend on are important. Our answer is essentially yes and. We want to create a unified graph abstraction that has all of the different kind of contributions that go into making a great open source project, whether it's writing documentation or fixing bugs or even giving presentations, and then combine that into a single graph and run PageRank on it. So that's how we get cred. Cred is basically the result of running PageRank with a lot of human guidance and supervision. It's project specific, so if Ethereum has a cred, it's totally different from IPFS cred. It's retroactively updated. So that means, let's suppose that you create a really valuable API, you submit it to a project, But it turns out you were a bit of a visionary, and nobody else realizes this API is important. So at the time it merges, you might not get very much cred for it. But then as time goes on, maybe more and more people start calling it, so it gets more and more weight in the call graph, and then you get updated to have a lot of cred in retrospect. And finally, it's forkable. So both because we think it's really important for how software develops in practice, and as the sort of last line of dispute resolution, you can always fork the cred in a project. One thing I think is important to emphasize is I think cred at its heart is not really new, it's just illegible. Lots of people are motivated to contribute in open source because they want to get reputation for doing it. We just want to make it easier to see that and easier for people to feel bought in and recognized. We think that cred can produce pretty good incentives for open source development. One is because it encourages adding long-term value. So this is in contrast to some other approaches for open source incentivization, like bounties. With a bounty, you're trying to get a fixed reward for solving a feature or putting in a bug or fixing a bug. But you're not really incentivized to stay around and care about the long-term maintainability of that code. Whereas with cred, your cred is directly tied to the contribution and pieces of the project you added. And if they wind up being unmaintainable, then your cred would decrease. Second, it's really not just a popularity contest. It gets a lot of data from signals that are really hard to game, like the actual function call graph of the project. And finally, we know from the example of PageRank that even, from the example of Google search, that PageRank is a surprisingly effective algorithm in practice for surfacing good results. One question I always get is, what are we going to do about gaming? Inevitably, once you have any reward metric, people are going to try to mess with it. And our answer is twofold. One is transparency. We want to make it really easy to see why someone has the cred that they have and tie that directly to contributions that they've made. And that will make it easy to see when someone's gaming. And second is community moderation. We want to empower the maintainers of any individual project to help step in and correct instances where cred is being abused. So as an example, suppose that I want to attack like a project and I go and create, maybe we're trying to reward people for triaging issues. So you get cred if you apply labels and maybe close issues posted by new contributors. I could go and make 100 Sybil accounts and post a bunch of bogus issues and then like label them all and try to steal a lot of cred. But it would be really easy for the maintainers of that project to be like, look, we see what you're doing. We're just going to like remove all this cred that you got through ill-gotten means. Like, don't do that again. So with that, I'm going to go and show off the prototype. This is a prototype any of you can play with. It's hosted on sourcecred.io/prototype. And let's start by taking a look at the cred for SourceCred itself. So we load all the data. We run PageRank actually in the browser. And now we can see all of the different nodes that are recognized as contributions in SourceCred. So we can go and look at, for example, the users. And we see that my collaborator, William Chargan, has the most cred in SourceCred. And that's because he's written all of these different pull requests. And we can see that each individual pull request is only adding a tiny bit of amount to his score. It's just that he has so many of them is why he has the most cred. It's worth noting that these scores, like just think of them as golf scores. Getting a lower score is better. Technically, that's because it's the negative logarithm of how much probability mass was attributed to the node. But you can just think 0 is the most impossibly good score and higher scores are less important. We can also then, for other people, we can take a look at, for example, Michael, and see that he has cred mostly because he's helped out with our problems with the GitHub API and figuring out why it gets rejected non-deterministically. And we hope that that will really be how SourceCred will feel in general, which is that for any individual person, you can kind of see what are the major contributions that person has made so that they've earned this cred. We can also take a look at the cred for a somewhat larger project. Now I'm loading the cred for JS IPFS. So that's the JavaScript IPFS implementation. And it takes a little bit longer because there's been a lot more activity. And as I said, we're running all this computation in the browser. And now we can see, for example, let's go and take a look at the issues. And we can see, okay, this is interesting. Like, we've got all these release issues are tending to get the most cred. The most valuable ones are released, then we have another release, then we have another release. So you might want to know, like, why is that? Why are releases so important? And we can open it up, and we see that actually the reason that this release is so important is because it references a lot of different nodes. So it references these pull requests. And we can think about it, and like, that's a little bit weird if you're getting all this cred just for referencing something. Like, I could create an issue that references all of your work without actually doing any work myself. So that's where SourceCred's configurability comes in. For every type of node, we can set different heuristics about how valuable that kind of node is. And similarly for the connections. And so in the case of references, we can see that the way it's configured right now, when you reference something, half of the cred flows from the thing that's referencing to the referent, or to the referenced object, and half of it flows back. And that's kind of weird. So maybe we should change it so that when you reference something, 95% of the cred flows to the thing being referenced. And now we can rerun PageRank with the new settings. And again, it'll take a couple seconds to compute that. And now we see that, okay, so this release is still important, but a lot of the other releases have dropped off. This one we were looking at that used to be the top has dropped off to maybe like 20 or 30. And this release is important mostly because it has lots of comments rather than because it referenced things. So that really shows how SourceCred is highly configurable and empowers maintainers to try and find the right set of weights. And the algorithm is really a starting point for a discussion rather than like some magical text handed down from on high. Just finally, I'll show off some of the limitations of SourceCred. I think it's always good to show what things don't work quite as well yet. And right now, we don't have great signal on the actual code and files of a project. So if we ask SourceCred, what is the most important single file in SourceCred itself, it tells us it's index.css. And that's clearly wrong. It's because right now the heuristic winds up being files that don't change seem really important, and we actually touch index.css very infrequently. So there's clearly some more work to do. So coming back to the presentation, what we want to do first, I'm a real believer that you should build software that gets in contact with reality and real users as soon as possible. And for SourceCred, we want to find a way that this can be useful to open source project maintainers today. And one thing that a lot of popular open source projects have in common is that they're kind of buried under open issues. So these projects all have like at least about 1,000 issues. And what's worse is that when you look at these issues, there's no real sense of which ones are important. It's easy to just get lost in them. I talked to the maintainer of a very prominent project recently, and he said his workflow was go to GitHub, open the issues, see that there are more than 1,000 issues, feel very sad, and then close GitHub. And so we need better tools. So our idea is that first we'll focus cred on rewarding people who actually start triaging these issues. Second, we'll build a cred-based system where you can prioritize open issues by reacting to them. So maybe a thumbs up means I think this is pretty important, and a heart means like I really want someone to take a look at this. And then since those reactions will be weighted by your cred, there's sort of a closed loop where you get rewarded for prioritizing issues, or you get rewarded for triaging issues by having a little bit more weight in the prioritization. At the same time, we're going to be focused on improving the quality of the SourceCred signal itself. So one thing we want to implement is called spotlights, and it's basically a way for contributors in a project to publicly shine a light and appreciate contributions other people have made. This could both be because maybe somebody makes a change that the algorithm just doesn't realize is important. So you go and create a spotlight saying, hey, this change, take a look at it. It was actually super crucial. And it could also be a way to get things that don't exist in the data model in. So for example, if right now I wouldn't get any cred for giving this talk because it doesn't show up in GitHub or in Git. But if somebody thought this talk was valuable, they could shine a spotlight and say, Dandelion gave this talk at Lab Day, and that was like pretty helpful to the project. Another thing we want to add is code analysis. So we want to automatically be able to import the abstract syntax tree for your project and then assign cred at the level of individual functions. And there's a group called Perspr that's actually already done this. They've built a system they call DevRank. So we're hoping to get their help in integrating this into SourceCred. We want to also add domains. The idea being that people actually make a lot of different kinds of contributions, and we want to recognize this. Contributing to bug fixing is not the same as contributing to documentation, but they are both valuable, so we want to be able to track them separately. And finally, we plan to add a lot of heuristics. So these will be project maintainer configurable systems that try to guess at which contributions are more valuable than others. So one heuristic might be that a pull request that changes 500 lines is, in general, more valuable than a pull request that changes only 2 lines. And it could get as complicated as having like NLP models that look at your issue comments and try to figure out which comments are actually important. Now the long-term vision, and this is stuff that's like at least 18 months out because we really need to get SourceCred working well before we want to attach money to it. But the long-term vision is financial sustainability. So we want to create grain, which I would call an economic primitive for open source. Grain is something that you earn by having cred. Grain is something that respects the open source project dependency. So every project is expected to flow some grain to the projects that it depends on, hopefully 20%. And grain is freely transferable. Unlike cred, grain is something that once I earn it, I could just send it or sell it to you. And the idea is that while cred can't be transferred because it doesn't really make sense to say, I give you the reputation of having written something that I wrote, like that's, you can't sell that. But by having cred, I'll earn a fraction of the project's grain every time it gets minted, and I can sell that. So one early way of seeing grain is it's kind of like a proof of patronage. And the reason is that you can only get grain in one of two ways. One is that you directly contributed to a project or its dependencies. And two is that you bought it, which transitively means that you bought it from somebody who must have contributed to the project. So in either way, you've supported it, either directly through your work or financially. So this means that anytime an open source project has some kind of reward that they can give to people who are involved, and it's a scarce reward, they could use grain as a principled way to allocate that. So one example would be if you want to give someone influence over the project roadmap, or you want to give them prioritized support or prioritized bug fixes, all the way to potentially giving out coins for cryptocurrency projects. So this is one area where I think ICOs have demonstrably really bad incentives for projects. If I launch an ICO, I get a very large sum of money that's uncorrelated really to how much development I later do, and it also doesn't translate to an incentive for anyone else to want to come and help out the project after the ICO is completed. So we imagine that grain will be a way of letting people fund a project that is kind of continually, incrementally aligning with the people actually developing it. And then once the coin or whatever is ready, you can just give it to the people who had the project's grain. So that's most of what I have to say about SourceCred. I'll just also throw in that, of course, this is an open source project. It's MIT licensed. I really encourage you to come and take a look at it, maybe hack on it. We're committed to being decentralized. We don't think we should ever have your data or have control over your projects. And it's gratefully supported by Protocol Labs. And they've been really awesome in working with us. So yeah, please check out SourceCred. If you are interested in contributing to open source projects or maintaining one, I would love for you to try it out and tell us how well it's working on your project. You can get all of the links to our GitHub and our prototype at sourcecred.io. And I'm happy to take any questions. Yes? If you don't get a mic, I'll just repeat your question. Okay, so I believe your question was, are we doing any sentiment analysis on the comments? So I actually used to work in machine learning, and that persuaded me that machine learning is actually pretty hard to do well. So I would say right now we're just totally focused on building a really general purpose system for creating these reputation graphs and using it to value contributions for open source projects. We're orienting the entire system around being really pluggable and really extensible. So our hope is that it will be easy for future people to go and build the sentiment analysis stuff, hook it in, and then any project that thinks that's valuable can just depend on it and turn it on.
I mentioned that because one use case is that, for instance, if there's a bug, and maybe someone makes a comment with a possible workaround, there's a lot of mentions saying, hey, thanks for that, and thanks for giving us a temporary solution. And doing sentimental analysis on that comment will give credit to the people or to the person that made the comment. So
right.
I don't know, it's just an idea that you could think on integrating later on.
So I think that for now, GitHub reactions give a good way to get access to that signal. Empirically, when I'm looking at a GitHub issue for some project and there's some weird bug and someone posts a good workaround, inevitably there are like 40 people who like thumbs up it. So I think even in the existing data that's easily accessible, people would get credit for doing that. Any more questions? Yes. Can you use the mic?
How do you make it decentralized if you tie to the centralized GitHub?
Right, so that's a great question. I think that right now it's kind of impossible to avoid that open source projects are pretty centralized around GitHub, and so we kind of need to go where the projects are. What we're trying to do is not add any additional centralization. So we're not going to be in the business of running like a SourceCred server that you submit your reactions to. Rather, the way it works is when you want to turn on SourceCred for your individual project, you yourself use GitHub's APIs to download the data store, and then you can publish it anywhere you want. So right now, SourceCred is actually using GitHub Pages to launch our prototype. So we have a deploy script that basically you type in the name of the repository you're interested in. It gets all the data out of the GitHub API. It publishes it in the form that you can use for credit analysis. And then if you want, you could even put that on GitHub Pages yourself. Or if you didn't want to use GitHub, then you could just push it to any other site you host. Any more questions? Yeah.
Cool. So, I mean, this looks awesome, but I'm wondering also, what's the size of the team and the contributors and all that for this to be useful? Because if we're like 2 dudes and we just update here and there and whatever, then I'm assuming that there's not going to be enough data or something for this to be really like useful for us. So how do you see like the typical team, the typical use case?
So if I understood that question correctly, you're sort of asking what is the size of team that SourceCred is focused on supporting?
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, I mentioned earlier the idea that SourceCred is really making legible something that existed, making legible and formal something that already exists, which is reputation. And I think that the larger the team gets, the more there's a need for that. So like William and I are developing SourceCred, and we use SourceCred because it's our test case. But the truth is that we already know, like we both have a very good sense of who deserves credit for which parts of the project. And we have a good mental map of all the different issues. But I think if you look at the case of all those projects that have like 1,000 open issues and have hundreds of contributors, that's where as a new contributor, if you send in a pull, you might feel like you'll never get seen, you'll never get recognized. And the point of SourceCred is to make it so even if it's a large project and you have make a small contribution, you'll still feel now like you have a bit of ownership and you were like seen and appreciated for that work. Cool. Am I out of questions now? Thank you very much, and please check out sourcecred.io.